synthesizer synths.
This beautiful looking device is the Lyra-8 from Soma Lab. They're a company that makes a whole host of weird and wonderful devices that encourage you to experiment with sound and interacting with electronic instruments in kind of different ways. I personally have been experimenting with this particular unit for the past 2 or 3 months, and I have to say a massive thank you to Signal Sounds in Glasgow. They are a boutique electronic music shop here in my hometown, and they have very kindly allowed me to borrow one of their demo units to try out for myself and do some videos with and all the rest of it. And over that time, I have come to really appreciate the Lyra-8, and so I am very privileged and pleased to be able to do a kind of proper feature video on it. I have done a whole bunch of other videos kind of experimenting with the Lyra-8 and also talking about some of its specific features, but this is the feature video where I'm going to talk about what I think about it in terms of a regular person who makes music and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in finding out what I think about this, you're in the right place. Now, I am not a huge ambient music person. I don't really like sitting to kind of droning music for half an hour or anything like that. I'm just not all that relaxed. I'm much more into the kind of up-tempo, hard-hitting, Mr. Wazzo kind of electronica stuff that is far more my pace. However, there's something about this device that has always intrigued me, and that's why I asked Signal Sounds if I would be able to borrow one of them. And part of it is just because, well, look at it. It's such an attractive musical instrument. All of the kind of knobs and switches are just kind of begging you to touch them and play about with them. And this is something that has been compounded when I received this with just how solidly made and how well built this thing is. Now, I know the Nick Bat has done a video where he opened it up and he's shown that there's no SMD components in here. It's all kind of through hole. And the care and attention that's gone into this is really obvious. It's so, I mean, even without opening it up, it's really obvious. It's a big, heavy machine, but not just that. All of the kind of knobs and switches and everything else, it just, it feels brilliant to use. There's something very tactile and inviting about it all. And honestly, even if I didn't, I wasn't bowled over by the sound or anything, I would almost say it was worth it just to get it for the build quality alone. It really is that fantastic. I'm not maybe I am over egging the pudding here, but it is just such a brilliant, beautiful device, and I have to say that, before anything else. Now, in terms of the signal flow and features, the most obvious kind of thing, or the most obvious starting point, is that we have 8 different voices or oscillators that are linked or listed, I guess, down the bottom here. And the way you interact or the way you trigger the sounds is by making contact with these 2 metal pads here for each voice. So there's a pair of them for each voice, obviously. Now, I do have to say it again that I've used some touch-sensitive devices and the experience has been not particularly brilliant, but these are solid metal. They just feel great to touch. There's no kind of issues with capacitance kind of not working or whatever, and it being intermittent. It just does work when you touch them. So for example, and that's the very basic gist of how you trigger voices on here. Obviously, there's other clever ways you can kind of keep things going without having to hold down the pads all the time. You've probably seen videos of people putting coins on each individual pair, and that does also work. Now, as we go up the device, the signal flow kind of goes that way. So you can see here that we've got different sections. So we've got 4 pairs of voices, and that means that certain parameters apply specifically to pairs. Certain parameters that you can modify apply to quads, so 4 voices. And certain parameters apply to individual voices. So you can trigger the voices individually, but then the envelope here, which is a fairly basic envelope if you're used to traditional ADSR envelopes, it is applied in pairs. So for example, we have a short envelope or a fast envelope. And that means the decay is, much shorter, or the release, I guess you should say. But if we switch it up to the non-fast envelope, there's a much longer tail on it, and that applies in the 4 pairs as I mentioned. You can tune each individual voice so they're not in pairs. And then we have some other parameters up here, including the waveform, which is under sharp. We also have the amount of modulation, and that is controlled by the pairs here. And this is really where it gets interesting, because the modulation is the kind of key to the whole Lyra-8 experience. Because on its own, this would just kind of be a drone machine, right? And drones are fun, but they're not all that interesting on their own, at least not to me. But this Lyra-8 machine has got a whole host of weird and wonderful modulation possibilities that allow you to kind of start to, it kind of eats itself in a beautiful way, where you can modulate, you know, not only send an LFO into a particular parameter, but you can also start to modulate, say, the pair 5 and 6 oscillator with 3 and 4, you can send 7 and 8 to 1 and 2, you can do a whole host of weird and wonderful things that might frustrate people that are used to kind of understanding signal flow in a very linear way. Because this thing kind of just, it encourages you just to experiment and tweak things and let everything kind of interact with each other. And that's why it's called an orgaismic synthesizer, because it feels like it is much more of an organic kind of way of evolving and producing the sounds. Now, this might sound like a load of hooey if you kind of are, you know, coming from the world of very specific very straight signal flows where you assign certain parameters to everything, but it makes a lot of sense. And even for me, who is a simple man, I will, you know, I'm not afraid to admit, there's something about this synthesizer that really encourages you to sit and tweak and play about with it and see what, you know, each individual setting change makes on the rest of the sound. Now, I guess we have to talk about the effects here, because the effects really bring in a whole new dimension, because the modulation in of itself is kind of wild and interesting, but then you throw in these effects into the mix and it really pulls everything into a whole new kind of spectral plane. We do have an LFO up here. It's called a hyper LFO. I believe there's 2 LFOs in here, but I can't remember. Probably should have checked. There's a couple of features or functions or options or whatever you want to call it with the LFO, and you can route them in different and, you know, kind of interesting ways. We also have a mod delay here, which is basically a delay that is a bunch of different parameters, different waveforms. You can choose to modulate it in a kind of a way which I'm not going to pretend to understand. It can either modulate itself, it can be modulated via the LFO, and you know, it kind of brings this extra element to things. And of course you can control not just the feedback but also the mix, so you can have a dry signal and then bring up the delay. And it's hard to give you a really nice musical example in a few seconds with this. It really takes time to explore and lose yourself in, but you get the basic idea, hopefully. Now, the final effect that is worth talking about, because it's the only effect left, is the drive here. And this allows you to really saturate the output. So we have our volume, but we also have this drive knob, and we also have a mix. And this drive circuit is interesting because you can catch some harmonics of the oscillators when they're kind of, you know, interfacing with each other that sound pretty fantastic, and you might have caught it there with the bass or not. Oh. It's hard to explain just how good it sounds when you start to find those sweet spots. And obviously, again, very hard to show you in a couple of seconds. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of sound design or tweaking things, but I honestly have kind of got lost for about half an hour or 20 minutes at a time, just finding those beautiful spots. And that's because this isn't really a device that is nice, you know, kind of soft ambient like I kind of expected it to be. It's not a simple drone machine. You get these kind of nice big sounds, but it's also quite haunting. And you get everything from kind of air raid sirens to roars and much more aggressive sounds than I ever expected to be able to get from this thing. And in all honesty, it kind of reminds me of the work that Nina Kravitz has done on the latest Cyberpunk 2077 soundtrack. And I hope that is the right name of that game because I don't have a PS5 yet. But if you go listen to the soundtrack for that game, it's got these haunting textures in the background, which are then underlaid with this really, you know, kind of pumping kick. And that is the perfect kind of use, I think, for this, at least for me, because it allows you to create these sweeping textures that you would find in something like atmospheric techno. So it's not just kind of a device to sit here and go, you know, meditative and kind of stuff. It does have some interesting other applications. Now, there is no doubt that the Lyra-8 is an unpredictable device and it can be very difficult to tame, at least in the sense of traditional synthesizers, but there are some ways that you can wrestle it under control, and I have done some videos on specific elements of this, so it's worth going to watch them just now, or maybe in a wee bit if you haven't already. However, on the rear of the unit, we have a bunch of different inputs, and these are all in 1/4-inch jacks, and they allow you to inject some level of control from different external devices. So we do have an input over CV for the voices, and that allows you to control the pitch of the voices within the unit to some degree. And I say to some degree because it isn't 1 volt per octave or anything like that that's, you know, in any way kind of predictable. It's not, you know, what you expect it to be, really. So it does give you a wee bit of control, but it's not going to give you the kind of tuneful musical intervals that you might expect. So be aware of that. There is also CV control over some of the delay parameters. We also have what I think is the most useful one, and that's the one I've done one of the videos on, and that is the hold gate input. And this allows you to control the Lyra-8 in the sense that there will only be sound outputted when it receives a gate at the hold gate input. And this might seem like a bit of a, like, well, what is that useful for? But if you begin to think about how you can have your drones and then you can start to input gates and get rhythmical patterns, or use it to duck against a kick drum, and then start to think about the world of atmospheric techno or something like that, where it starts like battering this kick drum through a wall of aggressive, you know, generative drones. It's just, it sounds bloody fantastic, and that's one of my favourite features of this. You also, though, have an external input for audio, and that allows you to input various bits and pieces through the effects units up here. So you can use the kind of weird and wonderful modulated delay and everything else with your external drum machines or synths or whatever it might be. So you've not only got all of the drones, but you can also use this as a kind of effects box as well, which is super, I can't believe I said super, but really, really cool. And actually, you can get some of these as a kind of individual Eurorack module, which is something else to check out if you're not interested in any of the drone stuff, but just want a wild and interesting effects section. To sum up, the Lyra-8 is fantastic. If you're somebody who enjoys the process of making music that is ambient or exploring big soundscapes, then this is a brilliant synthesizer. However, it's equally brilliant for more traditional music genres like techno if you use this to create textures and atmosphere sounds in the background, and that's really what I've preferred using it for. Although, to be honest, most of the time I've been using this, I've just been literally exploring the kinds of sounds I can get out of it and not even necessarily making music with it. It's just been purely for the joy of using such a beautiful and well put together device. I know it might sound ridiculous, but genuinely, when I've been playing with this, after about 10 minutes of kind of droning noise or whatever, you start to get into a territory where it feels like you start to have a conversation with the synthesizer and it starts to be coaxed to life, and you get these amazing sounds that are really hard to replicate on camera, you know, at the whim, you know, for a YouTube video. But that kind of experience is something I've not had with any other synth, and for that alone, I'm almost tempted just to keep this, and Signal Sounds will just have to track me down via some kind of debt collector or something. But unfortunately, they do know my address, so it just means I'll have to move house. Anyway, I hope this was interesting. Obviously, this is a very complicated device to do one of these videos on, but maybe this will give you some idea, especially since this comes from somebody who is not an ambient music aficionado. Thanks for watching. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask while I've still got it in my possession before they track me down and demand to have it back. Do go check out Signal Sounds because they're very nice people, obviously. Maybe foolish people since they let me use this for so long. Goodbye.